the first thing to note, of course, is that you don't really know anyone until they assume that position of power. And let's also not forget that the first years of Putin's rule were the times when he was, in a sense, consolidating his power. He was fighting the oligarchs, essentially, the people who had put him in place, so the people who had allowed him to become president of Russia. And he was determined to show them that he was the boss. So in one sense, from a megalomaniac perspective, it was always there. The fact that he had to have ultimate control, he was the one, not they, who were going to shape the country's future. It suggested that there was always within him firstly a stripe of ruthlessness, and secondly, a sense of knowing what he wanted to do, which way he wanted to take the country, and the idea that he was going to be the ultimate arbiter of Russia's interests. And so I think even from those early days, you kind of got the sense that although his external positioning might have been different, internally he was going to brook no dissent. And then if you look at all leaders, you start off in a certain place, and the longer you're in power, the more you decide you want to stay in power. And I think that's the next thing. The fact that in 2008, when, of course, his time was up, essentially, Putin decided he wasn't going to go. He was going to do that little shuffle around with Medvedev when Medvedev became the president, but he was president in name. The prime minister had the power at that moment in time. The prime minister was Putin. And it was obvious at that point that he wasn't going to shuffle quietly off into retirement. And therefore, I think that the die was cast in that period to know that he was planning a dictatorship for life, essentially. And he would do anything to stick to that agenda and plan. Yes, I think from the point of view of oligarchs, that is over. The idea of the oligarchs running Russia, sure, there are people who've got large business interests, but they exist purely at Mr. Putin's pleasure. And anyone who's gone against him, he's crushed ruthlessly, as many of them, have spent time in prison and have discovered to their own, sort of sorrow. So the reality is that there's not a challenge essentially from the business class in the way that Russia in the 90s was being run essentially by that business class. So that was over. Now, the Slovakia are more interesting, of course. Now, the main, of course, thing he has in his favor is that most of the people around him are his old comrades from the KGB, from 1970s East Germany in particular. So I think those people have got an enduring loyalty to him as he has to them. And, they know that they go together, they survive together, they stay in power together, or they will all hang together. It's really, an obvious point to make. So because those people are the people essentially in power, the ones who are running the various intelligence apparatuses, that tells you that he's got a pretty good grip on it. And that doesn't mean it's a grip that can't be challenged. It doesn't mean that younger people might not be coming through. The longer people stay in power, the more complacent they become. And even though there's always a sense of paranoia around the regime and a sense of we must understand who the threats are, it is possible somebody could come through. And there are, of course, alternative power centers, the army in particular, the military, we should say, plus others. I mean, it was notable that the biggest challenge to Putin's rule in recent times came from the Wagner Group, from Prigozhin and his attempt to march on Moscow, which looked like it could have been successful had he continued. So there are always strange, kind of possibilities to undermine the regime. And I think what the Prigozhin sort of march told us was that the regime is only ever one step away from disaster, one step away from falling. And although Putin may have a superficial control over intelligence, over the business community, if a real threat emerges to his power, it's very unclear whether he'd survive it. But I think that the main problem he faces right now is that he's not won the war in Ukraine he promised he would win. And in a sense, for all the propagandizing and for all the storytelling, ordinary Russians will know that something is awry when Ukrainian drones strike Moscow or other, kind of Russian generals get assassinated on the streets. That is not a normal situation. And I think that creates a sense of disquiet, which others, if they were so minded, might be willing to take up and challenge him with. So is he, more secure than he was, say, 5 years ago? No, I don't think he is, because of the consequences of his own actions, starting a war in Ukraine that he hasn't been able to finish. And I think that makes him sort of vulnerable to those who say, we used to support you because you were efficient, you were effective, you were Russia's guardian, you made Russia strong. And for a period, he did that. But now you've shown Russian weakness. You've shown how poor our army is. You've shown how poor our tactics are. And that is not a comfortable position for any dictator to be in when his weaknesses have been so ruthlessly exposed for all the world to see. Mostly these cases, what you see is if the dictator has the willingness and the ability to use force to crush opposition, then he will likely stay in power. That's a sort of, lesson we've learned. We've just seen that, by the way, in Syria. Assad did not have the ability to use force in his defense, and as a result, he went. In previous years, he was able to use that force to defend his position, and he stayed. Now, of course, in Russia, there is no necessarily military threat, which is why the Prigozhin thing was so interesting, because there was a credible military threat for the first time. You had a force that was capable of sweeping into Moscow and removing him. But absent that, it's difficult to see, unless it was a mass popular uprising and people just refused to shoot on them, how he would actually go. The alternative, of course, would be that, within the circle, somebody decides that he has failed in some way, shape, or form. Russia is now teetering towards disaster, and he has to go in the traditional Soviet coup style, basically the internal coup, where 1 minute he's there and 1 minute he isn't. But I think that's less likely right now, given the people who are the most likely to launch the coup are his allies anyway, and it would be an extraordinary betrayal for that to happen, and would go against all that they were standing for. So, absent his own sort of mortality and illness and whatever, we've all heard the rumors that have gone on for so long about that. It is likely that he will stay in power until such time of his own choosing, or the Grim Reaper takes him. Well, I mean, the trouble is that the allies are all the same age as him, so it's not it's not a particularly sensible strategy. But that would seem to be right now where his mind would be. There's no talk of a dynastic succession. The Putin children are kept firmly away from the public gaze, and there's no suggestion that any of them are going to be coming forward to rule with daddy, as it were. But there are other allies he's had at various times. He's had favorites for a long time. Sergei Shoigu was one of his favorites, of course, until he fell out with him. There are others who have fallen out with him. Medvedev back in the day was seen as a pliable person who he would quite happily have passed control over to. But it's unclear right now who, if you like, his favorite would be. And that is a problem for the regime, because it is very much based on Putin's own personal power. And there is obviously the potential for a collapse if he dies, and this is unclear. It might be, warfare between various factions who might want to take over. There might well be, a desire by some to say, enough of this. We want to try a totally different approach to what Russia looks like. And of course, that in itself, while that succession issue is left untapped, that does create instability again around the regime, and does mean that there's always the potential, even though it's unlikely, for someone to rise up and try and topple him, because they go, well, he's not showing any interest in succession, I'll make the succession for him. Well, I think what Putin, must do in the short term is secure some kind of victory from the Ukraine war, or something he can spin as a victory at the very least. Now, that's going to be difficult, because he's got the unpredictable Donald Trump to deal with when it comes to negotiations, and he's got to then kind of win out on the negotiating table with Vladimir Zelensky as well, who's shown himself quite a canny operator. But he's got to come away with something for this mess. If he comes away with something that he can say is a victory, then I would expect him to continue along the lines of trying to expand Russia's borders, and find other places, maybe Moldova, maybe even having a push into sort of the Baltic states, just to see where he could try and expand Russia's influence. I mean, what is now obvious is that there is no way back for him from the expansionist route he's chosen. He has, for the last few years, set himself out to be the restorer of the Soviet Empire. You don't go from that to suddenly being, okay, I'm going to be quiet now. Let's kind of work with all of you collectively in a sensible way. So his path for survival, as it were, is dependent very much on his being able to show foreign policy wins for Russia, because domestically, of course, the economy is a bit of a basket case. And although the sanctions haven't worked in the sense that they have driven Russia's economy into freefall, he's only one massive oil price cut away from economic disaster internally. And obviously, people who are aware of the shortcomings of their internal economies and their domestic situation often look to foreign adventurism in order to provide the way within which his regime can be secured. So I would imagine that whatever period Vladimir Putin's got left will be one of an aggressive Russia looking to take advantage of any weakness from the West or its neighbors, and trying very hard to push its borders, because that will be the way that Putin sees as the obvious path to securing his regime until he dies.